I have often reflected that the most extraordinary cases begin with the most ordinary of circumstances. On that particular October morning in 1929, I was engaged in the thoroughly mundane task of sorting through my correspondence when fate, in the form of a telegram boy, knocked upon my door and delivered what would prove to be one of the most perplexing mysteries of my friend Hercule Poirot's illustrious career. The telegram was brief, as such communications tend to be, but its urgency was unmistakable. Require your immediate assistance. Stop most peculiar circumstances. Stop Grand Belmont Hotel Mayfair. Stop Inspector Japp. I had scarcely finished reading when I heard the familiar tap of Poirot's walking stick upon my stairs. My friend appeared in the doorway with his customary precision, every detail of his appearance immaculate despite the early hour. His egg-shaped head was tilted at that particular angle which I had learned to associate with intense mental activity, and his green eyes held that peculiar gleam which indicated that his famous little grey cells were already at work. "Ah, Hastings," he said, settling himself in my best armchair with the air of one who has every right to be there. "I perceive that you too have received communication from our excellent Japp. The matter, it appears, is one of some urgency." "You've heard from Japp as well?" I inquired, waving the telegram in his direction, but naturally. And from the tone of his message, I deduce that we are confronted with something rather more complex than the usual sordid crime of passion or mundane robbery. Japp, he does not summon Hercule Poirot for the ordinary murder. Within the hour, we found ourselves in a taxi traversing the familiar streets of Mayfair, bound for the Grand Belmont Hotel. The establishment was one of London's most prestigious, a bastion of Edwardian elegance that catered to the cream of society. Its imposing facade spoke of discretion, luxury, and the sort of unshakable respectability that made scandal not merely unwelcome, but virtually inconceivable. Inspector Japp met us in the hotel's opulent lobby, his weathered face bearing an expression of profound bewilderment that I had rarely seen upon his usually confident features. He was accompanied by a small, nervous gentleman whom he introduced as Mr. Geoffrey Whitmore, the hotel's night manager. "Gentlemen," Japp began without preamble, "we have what you might call a situation. Mr. Whitmore here discovered something this morning that has left us all rather at sixes and sevens." Poirot inclined his head politely toward the manager. "Monsieur Whitmore, perhaps you would be so good as to relate the circumstances of your discovery." Mr. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he began his account. "It was young Thomas, our junior porter, who first found. That is to say, who discovered—" He paused, collecting himself with visible effort. "Room 312, gentlemen. A guest arrived yesterday evening, a Mr. Alistair Finch, who had reserved the suite by telegram. This morning, when Thomas went to deliver the morning papers and tea as requested, he found—" "Yes," Poirot prompted gently. "He found Mr. Finch dead, sir. Murdered, stabbed through the heart with a letter opener. But that's not the strangest part, if you can believe it." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed. Then pray, what is the strangest part?" Mr. Whitmore reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small, faded photograph. "This was found in the guest register, tucked beneath the reservation. It's a photograph of a gentleman named Arthur Pendleton, with an inscription dated 1910. The thing is, gentlemen, Arthur Pendleton died in 1918, killed in the war. I remember it distinctly because his family held the memorial service in our private dining room. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a particularly noxious cigar." Poirot examined the photograph with his characteristic attention to detail, his fingers holding it delicately by the edges. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "A room reserved under one name, occupied by a man of another name entirely, with the photograph of a third man, a dead man, hidden in the register. It has, as you English say, the makings of a pretty puzzle." Japp nodded grimly. "That's not all, Monsieur Poirot. The dead man, this Alistair Finch, He's not in any of our records. No one by that name has a permanent address in London, no bank account, no employment history. It's as if he appeared from thin air yesterday evening, only to be murdered before dawn." "And the room itself?" Poirot inquired. "It has been examined." "Locked from the inside," Japp replied. "No signs of struggle, no indication of how the murderer entered or left. The window overlooks a sheer drop to the street below, impossible to climb. Yet somehow, someone got in, killed Finch, and vanished like smoke." Poirot was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving thoughtfully about the hotel's elegant lobby. I could see that his mind was already working, cataloguing details and filing away impressions for future reference. "The guest list," he said finally. "I should very much like to see who else is currently residing in your establishment, Monsieur Whitmore. In my experience, when murder occurs in such a place as this, the killer rarely travels far to find his victim." As we made our way toward the manager's office, I caught sight of several other guests in the lobby. A distinguished elderly gentleman reading the Times, a fashionably dressed woman examining the hotel's art collection, a younger man pacing nervously near the reception desk. Each seemed absorbed in their own affairs, yet I could not shake the feeling that we were being observed, studied, perhaps even anticipated. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot murmured as we walked, "what do you make of a man who reserves a hotel room under a false name, carries no identification, and ends up murdered in a locked room?" "I should say he was hiding from someone," I replied. "Someone who found him despite his precautions." "Précisément. But consider this. Why choose the name Alistair Finch? And why hide the photograph of Arthur Pendleton in the register? These are not random acts, mon ami. They are clues deliberately placed for those with the wit to understand them." We had reached the manager's office, where Mr. Whitmore produced the hotel's guest register with hands that still showed a slight tremor. As Poirot examined the list of current residents, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Most interesting," he observed. "We have here quite a collection of individuals. Lady Pemberton in the royal suite, a widow, I believe, of considerable means. Dr. Marcus Ashford in 218, a physician recently returned from India. Miss Vivian Marsh in 156, described as an actress. And Mr. Roland Carey in 289, a gentleman whose occupation is listed simply as private means." "You think one of them is our murderer?" Japp asked. Poirot set down the register and adjusted his tie with precise movements. "I think, my dear Japp, that we are dealing with something far more complex than a simple murder. The reservation under a false name, the photograph of a dead man, the locked room, these suggest a carefully orchestrated plan. Someone wanted Alistair Finch found dead in room 312, and they wanted it to appear impossible." He turned to Mr. Whitmore with a slight bow. "With your permission, monsieur, I should like to examine the scene of the crime, and afterwards I believe it would be most instructive to speak with your other guests. In cases such as this, the truth often lies not in what we see, but in what we are meant to overlook." As we prepared to ascend to room 312, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation that always accompanied the beginning of one of Poirot's investigations. The Grand Belmont Hotel, with its facade of respectability and elegance, harbored dark secrets within its walls. Somewhere among its distinguished guests walked a murderer clever enough to commit an impossible crime and confident enough to remain close to the scene. But they had not reckoned with the methodical brilliance of Hercule Poirot, whose reputation for unraveling the most complex mysteries was matched only by his absolute determination to see justice done. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name had begun, and I knew from long experience that before it ended, every secret would be exposed, every lie unraveled, and every guilty party brought to account. The game, as they say, was afoot. We ascended to the third floor in the hotel's ornate lift, the silence broken only by the mechanical whirring of gears and Mr. Whitmore's nervous breathing. The corridor beyond was carpeted in deep burgundy, its walls adorned with tasteful oil paintings that spoke of the establishment's commitment to refined elegance. The atmosphere was curiously hushed, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Room 312 stood at the corridor's end, its brass number gleaming under the electric lighting. Inspector Japp produced his key with practiced efficiency. "Nothing's been disturbed since we found him this morning," he assured us. "The body's been removed, of course, but everything else remains exactly as it was." The room beyond was spacious and well-appointed, furnished in the Grand Belmont's signature style of understated luxury. Near the fireplace, a dark stain on the Persian carpet marked where Alistair Finch had met his end. The bed showed signs of having been slept in, its covers thrown back as if the occupant had risen suddenly. Poirot moved through the space with the measured precision of a conductor studying a musical score. He examined the window first, testing the latch and peering down at the street 3 stories below. The drop was indeed sheer, with no ledges or architectural features that might provide purchase for a climber. "The door was locked from the inside, you said?" Poirot inquired, turning his attention to the entrance. "Chain bolt and deadlock both engaged," Japp confirmed. "Young Thomas had to fetch the master key, and even then we had to break the chain. No other way in or out." "Quite impossible, yes." Poirot knelt beside the carpet stain, producing his magnifying glass. "The blood pattern tells us much. See here, Hastings." The victim fell forward, struck from behind. The angle suggests someone of moderate height, neither particularly tall nor short. I observed the scene with growing bewilderment. But if the room was locked from inside, how did the murderer escape? Patience, mon ami. Observe first, theorize later. Poirot moved to the writing desk beneath the window. Upon it stood hotel stationery, an inkwell, and an ashtray containing 2 cigarette stubs of different brands. He picked one up fastidiously with his handkerchief. "One is Turkish," he observed, smoked by one accustomed to them. The other, English with cork tip, smoked clumsily, with many droppings. 2 smokers, Hastings, our Monsieur Finch, and a visitor who makes cigarettes an occasional indulgence, not a habit. He opened the desk drawer, revealing a single sheet of paper, folded twice. "We found that earlier," Japp said. "Just one line, 312, under the old name as agreed. Posted yesterday afternoon." "The old name," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Not the false name, but the old name. Most illuminating." He examined the hotel stationery more closely, holding it to the light. "There has been writing upon this paper, but it has been removed. See the impressions left by a pen pressed firmly." Producing a pencil, he began shading lightly across the paper's surface. Gradually, like a photograph developing, faint impressions became visible. "The debt must be paid," Poirot read aloud. "Tonight, all accounts will be settled. And here, at the bottom, what appears to be the initial P." The implications hung heavy in the air. Mr. Whitmore's face had grown pale, while Japp's expression reflected grim satisfaction. "So our victim was expecting someone," I observed. "Someone with whom he had unfinished business." "Indeed. But notice, the message was written, then destroyed. Why? Perhaps because the writer realized it might serve as evidence." Poirot moved to the wardrobe, examining the dead man's belongings. The clothes were well made but unremarkable, bearing no identifying marks. A leather suitcase contained only basic necessities. No photographs, no letters, no documents of any kind. "Our Monsieur Finch travelled light," Poirot observed. "It is as if he sought to erase all traces of his former existence. Yet someone found him despite his precautions." He straightened, his examination complete. "I think, mes amis, that it is time we spoke with the other residents. In my experience, when murder occurs in such close quarters, the killer rarely resides far from his victim." As we prepared to leave, I noticed Poirot pause at the door, studying the bolt mechanism with particular interest. His eyes held that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with a significant discovery. "Tell me, Jap," he said quietly. "When you forced entry this morning, was the bolt engaged completely, or merely pushed across?" "Completely engaged, Monsieur Poirot. We had to use considerable force." Poirot nodded slowly, a faint smile playing about his lips. "Bon. Then our murderer is indeed clever, perhaps too clever for his own good. Come, let us meet the players in this little drama. It will be most instructive to see how they perform when questioned about their movements last evening." The locked room had yielded its secrets to Poirot's methodical examination, but I sensed we had only begun to unravel the complex web of deception surrounding the death of the man who called himself Alistair Finch. The hotel's private sitting room, with its burgundy wallpaper and heavy velvet drapes, provided an appropriately discreet setting for our interviews. Poirot had arranged the chairs with his characteristic precision, positioning himself to observe each suspect's face while maintaining an air of courteous informality. Inspector Japp stood near the door, his notebook at the ready, while I took my customary place at Poirot's side. "We shall speak with each guest individually," Poirot had declared. "In my experience, the truth emerges more readily in intimate conversation than in the confusion of group discourse." Our first subject was Mr. Roland Carey, a well-dressed gentleman of perhaps 40 years, whose sun-bronzed complexion spoke of recent travels abroad. He entered with an air of casual confidence, yet I noticed his fingers drummed restlessly against his cigarette case. "Mr. Carey," Poirot began pleasantly, "you have been residing here for 1 week, I understand." "That's correct. Just returned from the continent. Thought I'd put up here while I sorted out my affairs." His voice carried the easy assurance of a man accustomed to good clubs and better society. "And yesterday evening? Your movements, if you please." Carey's hesitation was brief but perceptible. "I dined out with a business associate. Returned rather late. Past midnight, I believe." "The nature of this business?" "Import trade. Nothing that would interest you, I'm sure." He flicked open his cigarette case, revealing Turkish cigarettes arranged with military precision. Poirot's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Turkish tobacco, I observe. A taste acquired abroad?" "Indeed. One develops certain preferences." Carey's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You encountered no one upon your return. The corridor to your room passes quite near to 312. "I keep to myself, Monsieur Poirot. Didn't notice anything unusual." After Carey's departure, Lady Pemberton swept in with the regal bearing of one accustomed to deference. Her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure, and diamonds glittered at her throat despite the early hour. "Really, Mr. Poirot," she declared, settling herself in the best chair without invitation, "this is most irregular. I cannot imagine what assistance I might provide regarding some stranger's misfortune. You knew nothing of Mr. Alistair Finch?" "Nothing whatsoever. I retired early with a book, something from the lending library. My maid brought tea at 8, and I saw no one after that." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Yet you have stayed here many times before, have you not? The hotel holds memories for you." Lady Pemberton's composure flickered. "My late husband conducted business here occasionally. We held a memorial service in the private dining room after the war for one of his protégés, Arthur Pendleton. Poor boy was killed in France." "Arthur Pendleton," Poirot repeated softly. "You knew him well?" "Not particularly. Geoffrey was always sponsoring young men of promise. Mr. Pendleton was an engineer, I believe. Brilliant, according to my husband, though I found him rather intense." "And you are certain you encountered no one last evening?" Her hesitation was telling. "Quite certain. Though I did hear voices in the corridor around 11. Guests returning late, I assumed." Dr. Marcus Ashford proved to be a tall, distinguished gentleman with the bearing of one accustomed to authority. His medical bag accompanied him, suggesting he had been interrupted during his rounds. "A most unfortunate business," he observed, settling into his chair with professional composure. "I understand the deceased was found in a locked room." most puzzling from a medical standpoint. You are familiar with such mysteries, Doctor. I've seen my share of unusual deaths during my years in India. The human capacity for violence never ceases to amaze me. And your own evening, Doctor? I dined alone in the restaurant, then retired to the smoking room with the medical journals. Returned to my room around 11:30. I'm a light sleeper, but I heard nothing suspicious. You observed other guests during the evening. Ashford stroked his beard thoughtfully. A young woman in the smoking room, quite striking, reading a fashion magazine. And I noticed a gentleman arguing with the desk clerk earlier, though I couldn't make out the details. As Dr. Ashford departed, Poirot turned to me with that peculiar gleam in his green eyes that I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. Most illuminating, Hastings. We have Turkish cigarettes, late-night returns, mysterious voices in corridors, and a connection to our deceased Arthur Pendleton. Each alibi appears solid, yet each contains curious gaps. He adjusted his tie with precise movements. The psychological game has begun, mon ami. Our murderer believes themselves clever, but they have underestimated the power of human nature to reveal itself under careful observation. The truth, as always, lies not in what is said, but in what remains carefully unspoken. Miss Vivian Marsh entered the sitting room with the calculated grace of one accustomed to commanding attention. She was perhaps 28, with auburn hair fashionably bobbed and dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. Her emerald silk dress was expensively cut, though something in her manner suggested recent acquaintance with such luxury rather than lifelong familiarity with it. "How absolutely thrilling," she declared, settling herself with practiced elegance. "A real murder mystery, just like in the detective novels. Though I confess the timing is rather inconvenient. I have rehearsals this afternoon for a new revue at the Piccadilly Theatre." Poirot inclined his head courteously. "You are appearing in a production, mademoiselle. Nothing too demanding, but one must maintain one's reputation in the theatre. We actresses understand the importance of careful observation, people's expressions, their gestures, the little betrayals of character that most overlook." "Indeed. And yesterday evening, your movements, if you please." Miss Marsh's fingers played delicately with her pearl necklace. "I dined alone in my room, exhausted from rehearsals, you understand. Later, around 10, I went down to the smoking room. I thought a cigarette might settle my nerves." She produced a silver case containing English cigarettes with cork tips. "You remained there long?" "Perhaps an hour. It's far more stimulating than my room. One observes such interesting characters. I noticed Dr. Ashford with his medical journals, quite absorbed. And there was considerable activity in the lobby earlier, a gentleman arguing rather heatedly with the desk clerk about room arrangements." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You observed this altercation?" From the mezzanine landing, the gentleman seemed most agitated about his accommodation. I heard him mention something about the old name and feeling exposed in his current room. Quite dramatic, really. "You did not recognize this gentleman?" "I'm afraid not, though I did notice Lady Pemberton in the lift when I returned to my room. She seemed rather flustered, muttering about voices in the corridor." After Miss Marsh's departure, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him. The contradictions in the various testimonies were forming a pattern, though one still obscured by careful misdirection. "Each account differs from the others," I observed. "Lady Pemberton claims she encountered no one, yet Miss Marsh places her in the lift at 10:30. Précisément, Hastings. And notice how each of our suspects presents themselves as reasonable, uninvolved observers. In my experience, truly innocent people are often gauche. They forget important details, contradict themselves over trifles. Our friends here are too well composed, too careful in their recollections." Inspector Japp entered, his expression grave. "I've had word from the Yard, Monsieur Poirot. That photograph of Arthur Pendleton, we've done some investigating. Seems young Pendleton was involved in rather serious trouble back in 1917, just before his death. What manner of trouble? Embezzlement. He was accused of stealing funds from a military engineering project, bridge construction specifications in France. Several investors lost substantial sums when the project failed. The matter was hushed up when Pendleton was killed in action, but the financial damage was considerable. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. And these investors, they would have harbored grievances? Indeed, the case files mention 3 principal victims. One was Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's late husband. The implications settled over us like a heavy curtain. Lady Pemberton had described Arthur Pendleton as merely one of her husband's protégés, yet the young engineer had allegedly ruined them financially. Most illuminating, Poirot murmured. The photograph in the register begins to reveal its purpose. Someone wished to invoke old memories, old debts, but who possessed such intimate knowledge of past grievances? A commotion from the lobby interrupted our discussion. Through the doorway, we observed Mr. Roland Carey at the reception desk, his luggage assembled beside him. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by barely controlled agitation. "Gentlemen," Mr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Carey has requested immediate checkout. He claims urgent business requires his departure for the continent." "How convenient," Poirot observed, rising with sudden energy. "And has he settled his account?" "Paid in cash, sir, a substantial sum, including penalties for early departure. Most unusual for a gentleman of his standing." We intercepted Carey in the lobby, where his hands trembled slightly as he consulted his pocket watch. His earlier composure had cracked, revealing something approaching panic beneath. "Mr. Carey," Poirot called pleasantly. "A moment, if you please, before your departure." "Monsieur Poirot," Carey managed, forcing a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "I'm afraid urgent business summons me abroad. Telegram from my partners, you understand." "Of course. But perhaps you might clarify one small detail from our earlier conversation. You mentioned dining with a business associate yesterday evening. The gentleman's name?" The hesitation was infinitesimal but telling. "Henderson, James Henderson. We discussed import matters at the Savoy. Private dining room, naturally." "Naturally. One final question, if you will indulge me. You are familiar with the name Arthur Pendleton?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Carey's face went ashen, his cigarette case slipping from nerveless fingers and scattering Turkish cigarettes across the marble floor. For a moment, the mask of the confident businessman fell away entirely, revealing something very much like terror. "I'm afraid I don't know the name," he stammered, but his voice carried no conviction whatsoever. "No matter," Poirot replied smoothly. "Bon voyage, Monsieur Carey. I trust your continental business proves successful." As Carey departed with unseemly haste, his luggage hastily gathered, Poirot turned to us with evident satisfaction. "And there, mes amis, we witness our first major breakthrough. A man's involuntary reaction to an unexpected name reveals more than hours of careful questioning. The psychological game has begun in earnest, and our quarry has shown his hand." Japp shook his head in amazement. "You think Carey's our murderer?" "I think, mon cher Japp, that Monsieur Carey knows far more about Arthur Pendleton than he wishes us to believe. Whether that makes him a murderer, or merely another victim of old grievances, remains to be determined. But his flight suggests that the past, as they say, has finally caught up with him." The hotel lobby had returned to its customary tranquility, but beneath that serene surface, the currents of an old and bitter drama continued to flow. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was revealing its true complexity, layer by careful layer. The afternoon brought revelations that cast our investigation in an entirely different light. Inspector Japp returned from his inquiries with a thick folder of documents, his expression grim with the satisfaction of a man who has unearthed buried secrets. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced, settling into his chair with evident purpose, "we've done some digging into Mr. Roland. Carey's background and the results are most illuminating. His father, Robert Carey, was indeed a junior partner in Pemberton and Company Engineering, the very firm that backed Arthur Pendleton's ill-fated bridge project in France. Poirot's fingers steepled before him with characteristic precision. So our fleeing Monsieur Carey has personal reasons for recognizing the name Pendleton. Continue, if you please. The family lost everything when the project collapsed in 1917. Robert Carey's investment represented his life savings, and when Pendleton was accused of embezzlement, the elder Carey faced complete financial ruin. He never recovered, took to drink and died within 2 years, leaving young Roland to make his own way in the world. The implications settled over us like a heavy curtain. Here was motive enough for murder, stretching back more than a decade and rooted in family tragedy. There's more, Japp continued. I've also checked Carey's supposed alibi for last evening. The Savoy Hotel has no record of any James Henderson, nor was any private dining room reserved under that name. Our Mr. Carey's evening remains entirely unaccounted for. A fabricated alibi, I observed. That hardly speaks to his innocence. Indeed not, Hastings. Yet consider this curious detail which Monsieur Whitmore has just revealed to me. Poirot turned to the hotel manager, who had joined us with obvious reluctance. Tell them, if you please, about Monsieur Carey's attempt to secure room 312. Mr. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. It was yesterday afternoon, around 3 o'clock. Mr. Carey approached the desk in considerable agitation, insisting that he needed to change his accommodation to room 312. When I informed him that the room was already reserved for a Mr. Alistair Finch, arriving that evening, he became most peculiar. In what manner peculiar? He demanded to see the reservation details, claimed there must be some mistake. When I showed him the entry in the register, he went quite pale and muttered something about games and old debts. Most unsettling behavior for a gentleman of his standing. Poirot rose and moved to examine the hotel register once more, his magnifying glass trained on the relevant entries with surgical precision. Observe, mes amis, the sequence of events. Room 312 is reserved by telegram in the name of Alistair Finch for yesterday evening. Yet hours before this mysterious guest's arrival, Monsieur Carey specifically requests that same room, displaying considerable distress when informed it is unavailable. You think Carey knew Finch was coming? Japp asked. I think, mon cher Japp, that someone wanted Monsieur Carey to know. Consider the psychological effect. A man haunted by his family's ruin suddenly discovers that room 312, the very accommodation he desires, has been reserved under a name that clearly disturbs him. This is not coincidence. It is orchestration. Poirot's examination of the register had grown more intense, his green eyes scanning each line with meticulous care. Suddenly, he straightened with an expression of profound interest. Most curious, he murmured. The reservation for Alistair Finch was indeed made by telegram, as recorded. But observe the paper quality of this particular entry. It differs subtly from the others. The ink, too, shows characteristics of recent application, despite being dated yesterday. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward anxiously. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, all our procedures were followed correctly. The telegram arrived yesterday morning, and I transcribed it immediately into the register. I do not doubt your integrity, monsieur, but I suspect someone has taken considerable care to ensure that this reservation appeared exactly as they wished it to appear. The question remains, who possessed both the knowledge to orchestrate such deception and the access necessary to implement it? At that moment, a hotel page approached with a small envelope addressed to Poirot in elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of hotel stationery, bearing a brief message in the same hand. The past refuses to remain buried. Some debts transcend death itself. The psychological game had entered a new phase. Our unknown adversary was no longer content to work from shadows, but had begun direct communication, confident enough in their position to taunt the great detective himself. Fascinating, Poirot observed, studying the handwriting with his magnifying glass. Our correspondent writes with the educated hand of one accustomed to correspondence, yet there are subtle variations in pressure that suggest emotional disturbance. This is not the work of a cold, calculating killer, but of someone driven by profound personal conviction. Japp's practical mind cut straight to the heart of the matter. So we're dealing with someone who knew about Carey's family history, knew he would react to the name Finch, and has been manipulating events from the beginning. The question is, are we looking for Finch's killer, or is Finch himself the puppet master? An excellent question, Poirot replied. But remember the locked room, the precise nature of the killing, the careful staging of evidence. These suggest not the work of an amateur driven by emotion, but of someone with considerable experience in the art of deception. He turned to survey the hotel lobby, where the remaining guests continued their daily routines with apparent unconcern. Lady Pemberton sat reading in her customary chair. Dr. Ashford consulted his pocket watch near the reception desk, and Miss Marsh examined the afternoon post with theatrical attention to detail. The answer lies among them, Poirot declared with quiet certainty. Someone in this hotel possesses intimate knowledge of the Arthur Pendleton affair, the Carey family tragedy, and the psychological pressures necessary to manipulate human behavior. They have used Monsieur Carey as both pawn and scapegoat, counting on his flight to provide convenient closure to their carefully constructed drama. But the locked room, I pressed, how was the murder actually committed? Poirot's smile held that peculiar quality I had learned to associate with significant breakthroughs. Ah, Hastings, that is where our killer has been perhaps too clever for their own good. The locked room was not the scene of the crime. It was the stage for a performance. The true murder occurred elsewhere, and what we discovered in room 312 was merely the final act of an elaborate theatrical production. The implications were staggering. If Poirot was correct, then everything we had assumed about the case was wrong. The locked room, the mysterious Alistair Finch, even Carey's panicked flight, all had been carefully orchestrated elements in a larger design. The psychological game had indeed begun in earnest, and our adversary had revealed themselves to be a master of human manipulation. But they had also made their first crucial error in directly challenging Hercule Poirot. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was about to enter its most dangerous phase, where truth and deception would clash in a battle of wits that could have only one victor. The evening brought with it a peculiar tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the Grand Belmont Hotel. Poirot had spent the late afternoon in contemplative silence, his green eyes reflecting that particular intensity I had learned to associate with significant breakthroughs. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a master strategist preparing his next move. The time has come, Hastings, to apply a different sort of pressure to our suspects. Thus far, they have controlled the narrative, feeding us carefully prepared statements and rehearsed alibis. Now, Hercule Poirot will alter the tempo of this little drama. He had summoned Inspector Japp to join us in the private sitting room, where Poirot proceeded to outline his analysis of the locked room mystery with characteristic precision. The bolt mechanism on room 312 possesses a unique feature that our killer has exploited most cleverly, he explained, producing a small diagram he had sketched. This particular type of lock can be fully engaged from the outside using a specialized tool, a technique sometimes employed by theatrical stagehands or those with mechanical knowledge. What appeared to be a locked room mystery is, in fact, an elaborate piece of stagecraft. Japp studied the diagram with growing interest. You mean the room was locked after the body was placed inside? Précisément. The cigarette evidence supports this theory. 2 brands were found: Turkish cigarettes smoked by our victim and English cork-tipped cigarettes smoked clumsily, suggesting nervousness or unfamiliarity. This second smoker was present during a conversation with Finch, but not necessarily during his death. Our discussion was interrupted by an unexpected development. Dr. Marcus Ashford appeared at the reception desk in heated discussion with the night clerk. his usually composed demeanor replaced by evident agitation. His medical bag lay open beside him, its contents partially visible. "I must insist on re-examining the deceased's effects," he was declaring with professional authority. "As the only qualified medical practitioner present, I have concerns about the initial assessment." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest as we approached. "Dr. Ashford, what manner of medical concerns prompt this sudden professional interest?" The doctor turned, his face flushed with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "Monsieur Poirot, having reviewed the circumstances more carefully, I believe we may be dealing with suicide rather than murder. The wound pattern, the victim's apparent psychological distress, these suggest self-infliction." "Suicide?" Japp's skepticism was evident. "In a locked room with no weapon found. The human mind under extreme duress is capable of remarkable ingenuity." Ashford replied stiffly. "I have witnessed such cases during my years in India, men driven to desperate acts by guilt and financial ruin." Poirot studied the doctor with that peculiar intensity that suggested significant interest. "You speak of guilt and financial ruin, doctor. What specific knowledge do you possess of Monsieur Finch's circumstances?" Before Dr. Ashford could respond, Miss Vivian Marsh descended the main staircase with her characteristic theatrical grace. She paused upon observing our gathering, her dark eyes moving from face to face with calculating assessment. "How fascinating," she observed, approaching with studied casualness. "Are we discussing poor Mr. Finch?" I couldn't help but overhear Dr. Ashford's theory about suicide. Though having observed Mr. Finch yesterday evening, he hardly seemed the suicidal type. The statement fell like a stone into still water. Japp's notebook appeared immediately. "You observed the deceased yesterday evening," he pressed. "This was not mentioned in your earlier statement." Miss Marsh's hand fluttered to her throat in theatrical surprise. "Did I not? How careless of me. Yes, I encountered him in the corridor around 9 o'clock. He seemed quite agitated, muttering about keeping appointments and settling old scores. He was pacing, checking his watch repeatedly as if waiting for someone." Dr. Ashford's face had grown noticeably pale during this recitation, and I observed his hands gripping his medical bag with unnecessary force. "You are certain of the time?" Poirot inquired quietly. "Quite certain. I asked if he required assistance, thinking perhaps he was unwell. He assured me otherwise, though his manner suggested he was steeling himself for an unpleasant confrontation." Poirot's attention shifted to Dr. Ashford, whose professional composure was showing increasingly evident cracks. "Doctor, you mentioned returning to your room around 9:30 yesterday evening. Yet Mademoiselle Marsh places Monsieur Finch in the corridor at 9 o'clock, apparently waiting for someone. The timing is most interesting, no?" The psychological pressure was beginning to tell. Dr. Ashford's fingers drummed against his medical bag in an unconscious rhythm that spoke of profound nervous tension. "Coincidence, surely," he managed. "Hotel corridors are hardly private thoroughfares." "Indeed not," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Tell me, doctor, during your years in India, did you perhaps encounter cases involving financial fraud? Military contracts or engineering projects that failed under suspicious circumstances?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Dr. Ashford's carefully maintained facade crumbled, revealing something approaching panic beneath. His medical bag slipped from nerveless fingers, its contents spilling across the marble floor, bandages, instruments, and a small leather journal that fell open to reveal pages of cramped handwriting. "I think," Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction, "that complete honesty would serve us all far better than continued deception, doctor. The psychological game has reached a critical juncture, and the truth will no longer remain hidden beneath layers of careful misdirection." The hotel lobby had grown quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelations that would finally illuminate the dark currents underlying the affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name. Dr. Ashford's journal lay scattered across the marble floor like the fragments of a carefully constructed facade. Poirot knelt beside the fallen items with characteristic precision, his magnifying glass revealing pages filled not with medical observations, but with meticulous financial records, investment details, and increasingly desperate entries, chronicling substantial monetary losses. "Most illuminating, Doctor," Poirot observed, his voice carrying that peculiar satisfaction I had learned to associate with significant breakthroughs. "This appears to be less a medical journal and more a personal ledger documenting considerable financial distress." Dr. Ashford stood frozen, his professional composure entirely shattered. The transformation was remarkable. The distinguished physician had become a man whose carefully maintained dignity was crumbling before our eyes. "Here," Poirot continued, turning a page with delicate fingers. "An entry dated 1917 detailing a substantial investment in Pemberton and Company Engineering, Bridge Construction Project France. And below it, in your own hand, total loss due to Pendleton's criminal negligence, family fortune destroyed." The implications settled over us like a heavy curtain. Dr. Ashford had been yet another victim of Arthur Pendleton's alleged embezzlement, his presence at the Grand Belmont Hotel far from coincidental. "Yes," Dr. Ashford admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "My inheritance, my medical practice earnings, everything invested on the promise of substantial returns from military engineering contracts. When Pendleton's scheme collapsed, I lost everything." Inspector Japp stepped forward, his notebook at the ready. "That gives you motive, Doctor. Strong motive for wanting revenge against anyone connected to the Pendleton affair." "Revenge?" Dr. Ashford's laugh held no humor. "I sought justice, Inspector, not revenge. There is a difference." Poirot rose, dusting his hands with characteristic fastidiousness. "Tell us about last evening, Doctor. Your true movements, if you please. The time for partial truths has passed." The silence stretched unbearably before Dr. Ashford finally spoke, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I received a note yesterday morning, slipped under my door. It simply said, 'Room 312, 10 o'clock. The Pendleton matter requires discussion. Come alone.' It was signed with the initial P, the same initial found on the impression in room 312. The psychological web was tightening. 'And you went?' Of course I went. After 12 years of poverty and disgrace, someone was finally offering answers." Dr. Ashford's hands trembled as he continued. "Finch was waiting for me, pacing nervously, chain-smoking those cork-tipped cigarettes. He was terrified, claiming someone else in the hotel knew his true identity and was trying to force his hand." "His true identity?" Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. He admitted Alistair Finch was false, but refused to reveal his real name. Said he was merely an intermediary, sent to gauge the feelings of Pendleton's victims. He spoke of a grand plan and final accounting, but remained maddeningly vague about details. Miss Marsh, who had been listening with theatrical intensity, suddenly moved closer. "And the argument in the lobby earlier, the one about the old name?" Dr. Ashford nodded reluctantly. "Finch had tried to change rooms, claiming he felt exposed in 312. He was desperate to avoid someone, though he wouldn't say whom." "What happened during your meeting?" Poirot pressed gently. "We argued. I demanded to know who was orchestrating this elaborate charade, who possessed such intimate knowledge of the Pendleton affair. Finch became increasingly agitated, insisting he was bound by oath to reveal nothing more. I left in disgust around 10:30, locking the door behind me out of habit." "And Monsieur Finch was alive when you departed?" "Very much alive, though clearly terrified. He was still pacing, still smoking, muttering about keeping faith and playing his part." Poirot examined the journal more closely, his green eyes scanning each entry with surgical precision. "Your financial records are meticulous, Doctor. They suggest someone with considerable organizational skills and attention to detail. 12 years of tracking every penny, hoping someday to recover what was stolen." At that moment, Mr. Whitmore approached with obvious reluctance, carrying a small leather-bound diary. Monsieur Poirot, we found this among Mr. Finch's effects. Most disturbing, I'm afraid. Poirot opened the diary, revealing pages of cramped handwriting chronicling the daily activities of Alistair Finch. But the final entry, dated yesterday, contained an ominous confession. The game nears its end. P demands the ultimate sacrifice. I cannot bear the guilt much longer. My true name is... The page had been torn out with violent force. Another layer of deception, Poirot murmured thoughtfully. Our Monsieur Finch was not the orchestrator of this elaborate drama, but another victim of psychological manipulation. Miss Marsh had grown noticeably pale during this revelation, her theatrical composure replaced by something approaching genuine alarm. Her fingers worried at her pearl necklace with increasing agitation. Someone in this hotel, Poirot declared, his voice carrying quiet authority, possesses intimate knowledge of the Arthur Pendleton affair and has spent considerable time orchestrating this reunion of victims. They have manipulated Dr. Ashford's desire for justice, exploited Monsieur Carey's family shame, and used the unfortunate Finch as an unwilling intermediary. He turned to survey our small group with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with approaching revelations. The psychological game has entered its most dangerous phase, mes amis. Our mysterious P has revealed their willingness to commit murder to achieve their ends. We must be prepared for whatever final act they have planned. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was approaching its climax, and I sensed that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The evening shadows lengthened across the Grand Belmont's elegant lobby as Poirot implemented what he termed his psychological stratagem. The great detective had spent the afternoon in careful preparation, and now the stage was set for a most instructive demonstration of human nature under pressure. The time has arrived, Hastings, he declared with quiet satisfaction, to abandon passive observation in favor of active intervention. Our mysterious P has controlled this drama from the shadows, manipulating each player with consummate skill. Now Hercule Poirot shall alter the tempo of their carefully orchestrated performance. Inspector Japp arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, bearing the documents Poirot had requested. His expression reflected the skepticism of a practical policeman confronted with his colleague's more theatrical methods. You're certain this will work, Monsieur Poirot? Spreading false information seems a dangerous game. In cases such as this, mon ami, truth emerges only when lies are stripped away, layer by careful layer. Our adversary has built their scheme upon psychological manipulation. We shall respond in kind. The plan unfolded with clockwork precision. At 7:30, Japp positioned himself conspicuously in the lobby, speaking and deliberately carrying tones to Mr. Whitmore about Scotland Yard's progress. The carefully crafted fiction was simple yet devastating. Military records had finally revealed Alistair Finch's true identity, connecting him directly to the Arthur Pendleton affair of 1917. The effect upon our assembled suspects was immediate and telling. From my vantage point near the reception desk, I observed each reaction with the intensity Poirot had taught me to employ. Dr. Ashford, seated in the smoking room with his evening paper, went rigid upon hearing Japp's announcement. His hands gripped the newspaper with such force that the pages tore audibly. The composed physician had been replaced by a man fighting to maintain control over some powerful emotion. Lady Pemberton's response was more subtle but equally revealing. She had been examining the hotel's art collection with apparent leisure, but at Japp's words, her walking stick clattered to the marble floor. When she bent to retrieve it, I noticed her hands trembling violently. Most intriguing was Miss Vivian Marsh's reaction. The actress had been reading in the mezzanine lounge, but upon hearing the announcement, she rose with such abrupt force that her chair overturned. She stood frozen for several heartbeats, her face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and what appeared to be genuine fear. "Phase 2, Poirot murmured. appearing at my elbow with his characteristic silent approach. Now we observe how each responds to perceived exposure. We withdrew to the private sitting room, ostensibly to review case files, but actually to monitor the hotel's corridors through the strategically placed mirrors that reflected the main thoroughfares. Poirot had positioned himself to observe without being observed, a technique he employed when studying human behavior under stress. Within 20 minutes, our patience was rewarded. Miss Marsh appeared in the third-floor corridor, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on urgent business. Most remarkably, she carried what appeared to be a hotel key, not the standard guest key, but one of the master keys used by management. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed, his green eyes sharpening with interest. Mademoiselle Marsh possesses access she should not have. Most illuminating. We watched as she approached room 312, glanced nervously in both directions, then unlocked the door and disappeared inside. The implications were staggering. Either Miss Marsh was our mysterious orchestrator, or she was acting under someone else's direction. "Should we intervene?" I whispered. "Patience, Hastings. Let us see what draws her to that particular room and whether she departs alone." 10 minutes elapsed before Miss Marsh emerged, her earlier confidence replaced by visible agitation. She clutched a folded paper in her hand and moved with the quick, nervous steps of someone who had discovered something both expected and unwelcome. But our surveillance revealed an even more significant development. As Miss Marsh departed, Lady Pemberton appeared at the corridor's far end, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years. Her usual regal bearing had been abandoned in favor of urgent purpose. The two women nearly collided outside room 312. Even from our distant observation point, their confrontation was clearly heated, though conducted in whispers that prevented us from discerning specific words. "Two players," Poirot observed with evident satisfaction, "both drawn to the same location by the same psychological pressure. The web of deception begins to unravel, mon ami." When both women had departed, separately and in obvious distress, Poirot rose with decision. "Now we shall examine what has so disturbed our suspects. The room that has been the center of this drama may yet yield additional secrets." Our investigation of room 312 revealed that someone had conducted a thorough search. The writing desk had been rifled, papers scattered, and the carpet showed signs of having been moved to examine the floor beneath. Most significantly, we discovered a small, leather-bound address book hidden behind the radiator, a hiding place that suggested intimate knowledge of the room's layout. The address book contained names, dates, and what appeared to be financial records spanning more than a decade. Several entries bore the initial P, and the amounts recorded suggested substantial sums changing hands over many years. "Blackmail," Poirot declared with quiet certainty. "Our Monsieur Finch was not merely a victim, but an active participant in a scheme of considerable scope and duration. The question remains, was he the orchestrator, or merely another tool in someone else's design?" The psychological pressure had achieved its intended effect. The careful facades maintained by our suspects were cracking under the strain of perceived exposure, revealing hidden connections and guilty knowledge that had remained buried for years. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was approaching its climax, and I sensed that the most shocking revelations lay just ahead. The address book lay open before us like a map of human weakness, its pages chronicling more than a decade of carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Poirot examined each entry with his magnifying glass, his green eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a detective finally grasping the full scope of his adversary's design. The web of blackmail. Revealed. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, indicating a series of payments recorded in meticulous detail. "Here we see monthly sums paid to AF, our unfortunate Alistair Finch, by someone identified only as P. The amounts are substantial and regular, suggesting not charity but payment for services rendered in a most methodical enterprise. The implications were staggering. Finch had not been merely an innocent victim drawn into someone else's scheme, but an active participant in what appeared to be an extensive blackmail operation targeting the survivors of the Arthur Pendleton affair. Each entry told a story of systematic exploitation, with payments flowing from multiple sources over many years. "But who is this mysterious P?" I asked, studying the cramped handwriting that filled each page with damning precision. That, mon ami, is the question upon which this entire psychological drama turns. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of every victim's financial circumstances, their deepest vulnerabilities, their most carefully guarded secrets. Someone who has spent years orchestrating this elaborate scheme of revenge. The psychological pressure takes hold. Our examination was interrupted by Inspector Japp's arrival, his weathered face bearing news of significant developments. Behind him stood young Thomas, the hotel porter who had discovered Finch's body, his hands wringing with obvious distress. "Monsieur Poirot," Japp announced grimly, "we've had developments that cast this entire affair in a new light. Tell them, lad." Thomas stepped forward nervously. "It's about Miss Marsh, sir. I saw her earlier this evening coming out of the service lift with a large traveling case. When she noticed me watching, she gave me a sovereign and told me to forget what I'd seen. But, sir, that lift connects directly to the 3rd floor. She could have reached room 312 without using the main corridors at all." The revelation struck like lightning, illuminating dark corners of the mystery that had remained hidden. Miss Marsh possessed not only unauthorized access to room 312, but also intimate knowledge of the hotel's service passages. Information that would have made the locked room deception far simpler to execute. "There's more," Japp continued, consulting his notebook with grim satisfaction. "We've traced Miss Marsh's background more thoroughly. Her real name is Vivian Pendleton, Arthur Pendleton's younger sister. The truth behind the mask." The psychological web suddenly snapped into focus with devastating clarity. The mysterious P was not seeking justice for Arthur Pendleton's victims, but revenge for Arthur Pendleton himself. Miss Marsh, Miss Pendleton, had spent years orchestrating this elaborate scheme to punish those who had destroyed her brother's reputation and driven him to his death in France. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, his mind racing through the implications with characteristic precision. The photograph in the register, the careful manipulation of Monsieur Carey's fears, the psychological pressure applied to Dr. Ashford, all designed to gather Pendleton's accusers in one place for a final, terrible reckoning. The pieces fell into place with inexorable logic. The reservation under a dead man's name had been a deliberate provocation, designed to invoke memories and guilt in those who knew the truth about Arthur Pendleton's fate. The hotel itself had been chosen not for convenience, but for its connection to the memorial service held here after Arthur's death. A service that his sister had undoubtedly attended, marking this place forever in her memory as a symbol of her brother's disgrace. "Consider the psychological portrait," Poirot continued, his voice taking on that particular intensity I had learned to associate with major breakthroughs. A young woman, perhaps 20 at the time of her brother's death, watching helplessly as his reputation was destroyed by accusations of embezzlement. She would have known Arthur's character, known him to be incapable of such betrayal. For more than a decade, that knowledge would have festered, transforming grief into something far more dangerous. The victim becomes the victimizer. Inspector Japp nodded grimly. So she recruited Finch to help her extract revenge through blackmail, using the money to fund her elaborate scheme of psychological torture. Precisely. But observe the fatal flaw in her plan, Poirot replied, tapping the address book significantly. Blackmail is a business built on trust between criminals. When that trust breaks down, violence often follows. The torn page from Finch's diary suggests he was preparing to confess, to reveal not only his own role, but hers as well. The psychological dynamics were becoming clear. Vivian Pendleton had constructed an elaborate fantasy of justice for her brother, using Alistair Finch to extort money from Arthur's alleged accusers, while simultaneously planning their ultimate humiliation. But when Finch's conscience finally rebelled against their scheme, or when his greed demanded a larger share, she had been forced to eliminate him to protect her larger design. The locked room was staged afterwards, Poirot explained, his fingers tracing the bolt mechanism's operation in the air. Using specialized tools that someone with theatrical connections might easily acquire. The bolt could be engaged from outside, creating the illusion of an impossible crime while she established her alibi in the smoking room. The gathering storm. At that moment, Thomas spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else, sir. About the lady's luggage when she first arrived. It was heavy, much heavier than clothes should be. When I commented, she said it contained research materials for a book she was writing about wartime injustices." "Research materials," Poirot repeated, thoughtfully. "Or perhaps evidence carefully collected over many years. Documents, photographs, financial records proving her brother's innocence and her victim's guilt. The tools of psychological warfare accumulated with the patience of one whose entire life has been devoted to a single, consuming purpose." The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was finally revealing its true nature. This was not a simple murder motivated by greed or passion, but an elaborate psychological drama orchestrated by a woman whose grief and rage had festered for more than a decade until it had transformed into something approaching obsession. The hotel's elegant facade suddenly seemed ominous, its quiet corridors harboring a woman whose thirst for revenge had already claimed one life, and might yet claim more. Somewhere within these walls, Vivian Pendleton was preparing for the final act of her carefully planned drama, unaware that Hercule Poirot had finally penetrated the psychological maze she had constructed around her brother's memory. The final gambit approaches. "Where is Miss Pendleton now?" Japp asked urgently, his hand moving instinctively toward his warrant book. Poirot consulted his pocket watch with characteristic precision, his expression reflecting both satisfaction and concern. "If I am correct about her psychological state, she will not flee. Her work here is not yet complete. She has gathered her brother's accusers, eliminated the one witness who could expose her methods, and now she awaits what she believes will be the final vindication of Arthur Pendleton's memory." He turned to survey the hotel lobby, where the remaining guests continued their evening routines with apparent normalcy, unaware that they were players in a drama that had been years in the making. "The psychological game has entered its most dangerous phase, mes amis. Our Miss Pendleton believes herself to be an agent of justice, correcting a historical wrong through her elaborate scheme of revenge. Such conviction, combined with the methodical patience she has already demonstrated, makes her perhaps the most dangerous type of criminal, one who believes absolutely in the righteousness of her cause." The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether Vivian Pendleton's long campaign of revenge would achieve its ultimate goal, or whether the psychological web she had woven so carefully would finally entrap its creator. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was approaching its climax, and I sensed that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The hotel's private dining room, where Arthur Pendleton's memorial service had been held 12 years earlier, provided a fitting stage for Poirot's final revelation. He had arranged the chairs with characteristic precision, positioning each suspect to observe their reactions while maintaining the theatrical dignity befitting such momentous disclosures. Lady Pemberton sat rigidly upright. Dr. Ashford clutched his medical bag like a talisman, and Miss Vivian Marsh entered with her customary grace, though I detected a subtle tension beneath her polished exterior. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with formal courtesy, "we gathered to resolve the affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name. This case began with an apparent impossibility, a locked room murder, but that was merely the final act of a drama that commenced in 1917 with Arthur Pendleton's disgrace and death. He moved to the room's center, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose I'd witnessed before his most brilliant expositions. Someone close to Arthur Pendleton never accepted the accusations of embezzlement. Someone who knew him to be innocent spent 12 years gathering evidence while orchestrating an elaborate scheme of psychological revenge against those she held responsible for his destruction. Miss Marsh's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her pearl necklace, that nervous gesture I had observed throughout our investigation. Arthur Pendleton had a younger sister, Poirot continued, his green eyes fixed upon Miss Marsh with unwavering intensity. A young woman who adopted the identity of Vivian Marsh, trained herself in theatrical arts, and recruited accomplices like Alistair Finch to execute a methodical campaign of blackmail and psychological torture. The effect was immediate and devastating. Miss Marsh's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the accumulated rage of more than a decade. Vivian Pendleton, Poirot said quietly, using her true name with deliberate precision. The address book hidden in room 312 documents years of systematic extortion. The amounts were substantial, enough to fund your elaborate scheme while maintaining the comfortable lifestyle necessary for your theatrical career. They destroyed him, she whispered, her voice carrying the fury of buried grief. Arthur was innocent, incapable of the crimes they accused him of committing. They needed a scapegoat for their own failures, and my brother paid with his life for their greed and incompetence. Lady Pemberton rose unsteadily. Arthur Pendleton was guilty of embezzlement. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was fabricated, Miss Pendleton replied with venomous precision. Arthur discovered irregularities that implicated your husband and his partners in systematic fraud. When he threatened exposure, they turned the accusations against him. Dr. Ashford's medical bag crashed to the floor. You're saying we were the real criminals? I'm saying my brother died believing himself dishonored when he was actually the only honest man among you, she declared, her theatrical training lending power to every syllable. For 12 years, I've made you pay for maintaining your reputations while his name was dragged through the mud. Poirot nodded gravely. The psychological torture was as important as the financial extortion. But when Alistair Finch's conscience rebelled, when he threatened to confess and destroy your carefully constructed scheme, you were forced to eliminate him. He produced his small diagram of the bolt mechanism. The locked room was theatrical illusion, mademoiselle. Your stage connections provided access to the specialized tool that engages this particular bolt from outside. You entered room 312 after Finch's meeting with Dr. Ashford, found him preparing to betray you, and silenced him with the letter opener. Then you simply locked the door from outside, creating an impossible crime. The admission came with surprising calm. Finch was weak. He wanted to confess, to clear his conscience and destroy everything I'd worked to achieve. Arthur's vindication was worth more than one man's guilty feelings. Inspector Japp stepped forward, warrant book in hand. Vivian Pendleton, I arrest you for the murder of Alistair Finch and conspiracy to commit blackmail. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Miss Pendleton maintained her theatrical composure with remarkable dignity. Arthur was innocent, she declared, her voice carrying across the room with absolute conviction. Whatever else I may have done, I've proven that much. The real criminals are sitting in this room, finally exposed. As Vivian Pendleton was led away, her head held high with the dignity of one who believed absolutely in her cause's righteousness, Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. There is a saying, Hastings, he observed quietly. Justice delayed is justice denied. But when one seeks to correct injustice with murder, one does not restore balance. One merely adds to the sum of human misery. The little grey cells can solve the mystery, but they cannot mend the broken hearts they so unerringly expose. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name was concluded, its psychological reverberations destined to continue long after the last suspect had departed the Grand Belmont Hotel. The morning following Vivian Pendleton's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to the Grand Belmont Hotel, as though the building itself were recovering from the psychological tempest that had raged within its elegant walls. Poirot and I took breakfast in the dining room, where the familiar ritual of precisely arranged silverware and carefully buttered toast seemed to restore some measure of order to a world that had been thoroughly disrupted by human passion and long-buried secrets. The weight of revelation. Inspector Japp arrived with documents that cast the entire affair in a more complex light than even Poirot had anticipated. The War Office archives had yielded correspondence suggesting that Arthur Pendleton's accusations of embezzlement were not entirely without foundation, though the truth was characteristically more nuanced than Vivian's absolute certainty had allowed. It appears, Japp explained with evident discomfort, that young Pendleton had indeed discovered irregularities in the bridge construction project. Not the systematic fraud his sister claimed, but corner-cutting and inflated costs that Lord Pemberton and his associates had employed to maximize profits during wartime shortages. Poirot absorbed this information with characteristic precision. So Arthur Pendleton was neither the complete innocent his sister believed, nor the criminal his accusers claimed. He was a young idealist who stumbled upon practices that, while morally questionable, were unfortunately common during the chaos of war. The psychological portrait became increasingly complex as the full scope of the tragedy emerged. Arthur had threatened to expose practices that, while ethically dubious, were not strictly illegal under wartime regulations. His accusers had responded by turning the tables, using his access to funds as evidence of embezzlement when the project failed, due to wartime material shortages rather than criminal negligence. The human cost. Lady Pemberton appeared in the dining room as we concluded our discussion, her usual regal bearing replaced by something approaching fragility. The revelations had stripped away the comfortable certainties that had sustained her for more than a decade. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, settling herself with visible effort, "I have spent the night examining my conscience. Geoffrey was not the villain that woman painted him to be, but neither was he entirely innocent. We chose to accept the convenient explanation because it preserved our comfort and our reputation." Her admission carried the weight of years of willful blindness, the psychological price of choosing easy lies over difficult truths. Dr. Ashford joined us shortly thereafter, his medical bag absent for the first time since our acquaintance began. His professional composure had been replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man confronting the full consequences of his choices. "I wanted justice for my family's losses," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I allowed that desire to lead me into complicity with blackmail and psychological torture. The irony is that Vivian Pendleton, in her twisted pursuit of revenge, has exposed more truth about the original affair than 12 years of my bitter resentment ever achieved." Poirot's final analysis. As the morning progressed and the last of the official procedures concluded, Poirot reflected on the psychological dimensions of the case with his characteristic insight into human nature. "The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name," he observed, adjusting his tie with precise movements, "has revealed itself to be a meditation on the nature of justice and the terrible prices we pay when legal systems fail to satisfy our deepest needs for moral resolution." He paused, his green eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but also the melancholy of truths that brought no real comfort to anyone involved. Vivian Pendleton created an elaborate, locked-room mystery as the perfect metaphor for her own psychological prison. She believed she could lock away the truth of her brother's disgrace and unlock it only on her own terms at a time and place of her choosing. But truth, Hastings, is not so easily controlled. It has a way of escaping even the most carefully constructed chambers. The final reckoning. The hotel register lay open on the reception desk as we prepared to depart, Arthur Pendleton's name still visible in faded ink beneath the false identity that had triggered the final act of this long drama. Poirot studied it with something approaching reverence. The dead do not rest easily when their reputations remain stained by half-truths and convenient lies, he observed quietly. Miss Pendleton understood this fundamental human truth, though she chose methods that ultimately corrupted her noble intentions. As our taxi pulled away from the Grand Belmont Hotel, Poirot settled back with his characteristic air of satisfied completion. Justice has been served, mon ami, though perhaps not in the form any of the participants originally envisioned. The scales have been balanced, not through revenge or legal vindication, but through the simple exposure of truth in all its uncomfortable complexity. The affair had concluded, leaving in its wake not the tidy resolution of popular fiction, but the messy, morally ambiguous aftermath that characterizes real human drama. The room reserved under a dead man's name had finally served its purpose, not as a stage for revenge, but as a catalyst for the kind of painful honesty that alone can provide genuine resolution to the deepest human conflicts. We had departed London for the quiet seaside town of Brighton, where Poirot declared himself in need of the restoration of the mental equilibrium after the psychological complexities of our recent case. The Grand Belmont Hotel seemed a world away as we sat in the morning room of our modest lodgings, the autumn sun casting gentle patterns across the breakfast table where Poirot arranged his fruit with characteristic geometric precision. "Tell me, Hastings," he began, delicately sectioning an orange with mathematical exactitude. "What do you make of this affair now that the dust has settled?" I considered the question carefully. A woman driven by grief to commit murder in pursuit of justice for her brother. Tragic, certainly, but not particularly complex. Poirot shook his head with gentle reproach. "Ah, mon ami, you see only the surface. This case contained not one tragedy, but three distinct human dramas, each illuminating a different aspect of the human condition." "Three," I echoed, intrigued despite myself. "But certainly. First, the tragedy of Arthur Pendleton himself, a young idealist who discovered irregularities in wartime contracts and believed, with the naivety of youth, that exposing corruption would simply correct an error. He failed to understand that he threatened not merely money, but reputations, positions, entire social structures. His innocence destroyed him as surely as any guilt. I recalled the faded photograph from the hotel register, that earnest young face whose name had become the seed of so much bitterness. "The second tragedy," Poirot continued, arranging orange segments in a perfect circle, "belonged to his accusers. Lady Pemberton, Dr. Ashford, the Carey family. They committed initially perhaps only the sin of cowardice, accepting a convenient explanation because it protected their interests. But observe how guilt, once established in the conscience, creates its own prison more secure than any locked room. You believe they knew of their injustice? The little grey cells remember what the heart wishes to forget, Hastings. That is why Vivian's psychological pressure proved so effective. She exploited vulnerabilities that guilt had already created. Inspector Japp had visited yesterday with news of the participants' subsequent actions. Lady Pemberton had established a scholarship in Arthur Pendleton's name, while Dr. Ashford planned to return his blackmail payments to charity and resume medical missionary work. Even Roland Carey, whose panicked flight had initially marked him as our prime suspect, was liquidating his continental business to create a fund for war victims whose reputations had been unjustly tarnished. "And the third tragedy," I prompted. Poirot's expression grew melancholy. The tragedy of Vivian herself, a heart that could not accept the imperfection of truth. Her brother must be absolutely innocent, his accusers absolutely guilty. For 12 years, she lived within that certainty as within a locked room, nurturing her grievance until it consumed her humanity entirely. He paused, then added quietly, "In seeking to become Arthur's avenging angel, she became precisely what she most despised, a manipulator of truth for personal ends." Yet she did achieve something, I argued. The investigation revealed the true nature of the bridge project irregularities. Précisément. Truth emerged, but not through her elaborate scheme of revenge, rather through the simple application of logic to the evidence her crimes created. Justice has its own inexorable logic, mon ami, operating independently of human schemes to direct or pervert it. A seagull cried outside our window, its voice mingling with the distant murmur of waves. Poirot rose and moved to observe the peaceful street scene, his silhouette reflecting deep contemplation. The locked room was never really about mechanical impossibility, he observed. It was the perfect metaphor for the psychological prisons each character had constructed around their guilt and secrets. Vivian merely made visible what was already true, that they were all trapped by choices made 12 years earlier. He retrieved his hat and walking stick, preparing for our morning constitutional with ritual precision. Consider this final irony, Hastings. Arthur Pendleton's name has finally been cleared, not through his sister's elaborate revenge, but through the investigation her crimes necessitated. The truth she sought to impose through murder and blackmail emerged naturally through patient observation and logical deduction. As we prepared to depart, Poirot paused with that slight smile I had learned to associate with his most profound insights. The human heart remains the greatest mystery of all, mon ami. The little gray cells can solve any puzzle of human devising, but the puzzle of human nature itself, that remains forever beyond even the most brilliant detective. He adjusted his tie with final precision. Still, we must create order where we may, in our thoughts, our methods, our small daily rituals. It is a modest defense against chaos, but a necessary one. The morning air was crisp and clean as we stepped into the Brighton sunshine, leaving behind the psychological complexities of the Grand Belmont Hotel. The affair of the room reserved under a dead man's name had concluded, but its lessons about justice, guilt, and the prices we pay for our choices would linger long after the final page was turned.